I am pleased to welcome Dr. Bloodine Barthelus, who will lead our discussion today. Dr. Barthelus is Senior Director of Practice at CASEL, and in that role, she oversees initiatives designed to support and scale SEL across school districts, regional offices of education, and other collaborators. In addition, she uses her experience to support the implementation of SEL in service of equity. Welcome, Bloodine.
You, Emily. I'm really happy to be here with all of you and excited about the conversation that we will have together around adult SEL. To start us all off, we want to create an opportunity for us to just kind of reflect on a few things as it relates to adult SEL and to invite you all to do that. Want to give you an opportunity to think about a time when, as a youth, as a young child, think about a time when you felt seen, valued, and affirmed by an adult in your life. Just reflect on that for just a little bit. And then what qualities or attributes did that adult demonstrate to lead to this experience? So I'm just going to give you just a few seconds to kind of reflect on that. If you have some paper and pen, or maybe even on your computer, jot down what that experience was and what qualities or attributes did that adult demonstrate to lead to that experience. So, one of the reasons why we open up with a question like this is because when we sit back and kind of reflect on some of the experiences that we've had that have been centering for us, grounding for us, and really allow us to feel as if we are sitting in spaces that were created for us, we recognize how much value it brings to our overall well being. And these are the types of experiences that we want to continue to create, and we want to be intentional about developing for our young people every day that they walk into our schools and every day that they walk into our classrooms. So I hope just reflecting on that really brought a sense of peace and joy to you, because that's what we're attempting to do in the conversations that we have around adult SEL. So thank you for participating in that. So, in our time together, we want to make sure that we are all on the same page when we're talking about what adult SEL is. We continue to talk even in our first session. So, this is just a reiteration. So, those of you who have seen this before, you might know this already. If you're new to the series, welcome. This is our grounding definition around what we mean by adult SEL. It's the process that really allows for just this ongoing human development piece that happens for young people and adults. It is also the authentic partnerships that we form with schools, with families, with communities. And it's this recognition that there is a level of expertise and wisdom and knowledge that all of these stakeholders bring that can really help us to build a strong collective and a strong community together. It speaks to the types of relationships that we want to develop with one another, and the fact that they have to be trusting and collaborative, and opportunities where individuals have just as much opportunity to share and provide input and feedback into the environments that are being created. And then lastly, it's the opportunity for us to roll up our sleeves and really empower young people and for us as adults to co-create these schools that really allow for thriving for young people, for adults to have well-being in these spaces, and for these spaces to be safe and healthy and really contributing to our overall collective. So now that we know what adult SEL is, let's talk about who we are talking about when we say adult SEL. When you look at these rings, this really speaks to the systemic nature of social emotional learning. And it calls out the fact that there is an ecosystem of learning where young people are learning not just in classrooms, but they're learning in their homes, they're learning in their communities, the schools that they are part of. They are all touch points where they are interfacing with a number of different adults in every single aspect that they are involved in. Every single adult that lives within that classroom, school, family, community are the adults that we are calling attention to when we say adult SEL. So we want to ensure that when we talk about the competencies, when we talk about the ways in which we're creating community, that we are pulling in the knowledge, the skills, the attitudes that every single adult and across all of these different locations actually are and speak to the young people that we are involved in supporting. So now we've talked about what adult SEL is. We've talked about the adults and who exactly we're actually speaking to. Now let's talk about how we actually do this work of adult SEL. So there are three different elements or components that we look at. You'll see them here. We talk about the learn piece, then we talk about connect and collaborate, and then the final piece is model. When we talk about learn, this is exactly what we're doing in this space and time together right now. Learning really is about the accuracy by which we know ourselves, by which we know our communities, and the stance of curiosity that we choose to assume so that we are consistently learning, reflecting, adjusting based on what we're learning in the environment around us. Recognizing that there is always room to learn more is something that we embed within this concept of learn as it relates to adult SEL. The other piece about learn is that it happens through our personal and professional learning. It's not just the PD that we do in schools. It's not just the times that we come together in conferences and convenings, but it's in the reflections that we have. It might be in the journaling that happens so that you have this ongoing personal learning that happens as well. And then that reflects back into what the learn that happens between staff, between us and students, and between the families that we serve as well. When we talk about connect and collaborate, this is where we're really talking about how are we creating the types of communities that can really foster this sense of connection, that can really foster this sense of belonging, and allow us to practice all of which we are learning in the learn phase of the adult SEL model. It also allows us to create spaces that speak to the needs and that actually affirm students, families, staff in a way that recognizes their humanity and centers their experiences in a way that speaks to them. The collaborate piece really allows us to implement a shared model, a shared understanding of what social emotional learning is, so that the entire ecosystem of learning is actually strengthened. And then when we talk about model, I always like to bring up a great quote by James Baldwin, who says that children have never been good at listening to their elders, but they have never failed to emulate them. And so this model piece really talks about how we actually embody the competencies that we talk about, that we learn about, that we say our students should have, but sometimes we may fail to emulate from time to time. So it's how do we stand in this space and become the examples of the mindsets, the skills, the attitudes that we want our young people to show up as well. It allows us to have authentic partnerships between our students, between one another, between staff, caregivers, and our communities. And then through the leadership practices, the leadership allows us to actually come together and create the space so that modeling, learning, connection, and collaboration can happen on a consistent basis. So that is framed for you what adult SEL is, what it is, who we're talking about, and how we actually do it. And so we want to finish this overview section with just a little bit of research. Why are we actually doing this at a time when everyone is strapped for time, at a time when everyone is tired, burnt out? There's a ton on everyone's plate. Why create the time and space for social emotional learning, particularly for adults? And so we want to bring your attention to some of the research. Right now, what we are seeing is that when SEL is prioritized for educators and when they have strong social and emotional competence and that space is created for them to continue to cultivate it, there's less burnout. Educators stay in classrooms a lot longer. We know that we're facing a significant educator shortage, where they're building and maintaining stronger relationships with our young people. And they're also demonstrating higher levels of patience, of empathy, and of healthy communication with our young people. The other piece here is that teachers who teach SEL to students are also more effective at managing the ups and downs of what might actually show up in the classroom. Whether students are having a tough day or not, whether their behaviors are aligned in a way that speaks to easy instruction or more challenging instruction, they can manage it with a lot less anxiety when these aspects of their own well-being and their own competence is actually developed. And so although the time is short, these go to show that there is much benefit in actually investing in the time to support educators in this area. And so to build on this conversation, we want to I'm really thrilled to invite our panel of experts. I'd like to call them experts because of the work that they do in this field. So I'll introduce them one at a time. Our first is Jennifer Ahn. She's the interim executive director of Lead by Learning. Jennifer Ahn oversees organizational strategy and program innovation to develop adult learning cultures that support curiosity, connection, and continuous improvement. Really happy to have you here, Jennifer, with us. The next person I'll introduce for you is Mai Xi Lee. Mai Xi is the Social Emotional Learning Director at the Sacramento County Office of Education. She's a veteran educator who served the Sacramento region for 25 years as a bilingual paraprofessional, teacher, counselor, school administrator, and district administrator. Happy to have you here, Mai Xi. And then finally, we have Sue Wilson. Sue is the superintendent of the Mapleton School District in Oregon and aims to make the district the model rural community school and a hub of community connection and resources. She also works part-time for Lane Education Service District. Really happy to have you, Sue, as well. So to all of our esteemed panelists, I'm sure that people are ready for us to dig in and just ask you some questions, so I will jump right in. Jennifer, let's start with you. You have designed a group of educators or a group for educators who are leading SEL implementation at school sites. You've named it Lead Learners. Can you share with us how that group works and a little about what they are learning and what they are leading?
Yes, first of all, it's great to be here, and it's exciting to talk about this work because the Lead Learner Group actually was created in 2012, so it's been 10 years in existence. It was designed in partnership with district leaders and teachers from Oakland Unified, and at that time, they were shifting a dream and a goal of integrating SEL across all of their schools and taking that into implementation and practice. How do we get the curriculum that we identified, caring school community? How do we get this value that we have as a district and actually have it come to life for students in classrooms? And so the theory of action was, instead of as district leaders, us just telling people how to do this work, what if we built the capacity of teachers at sites to learn about how to integrate SEL into existing academic curriculum and then support their colleagues to do the same, and do that by leading from a learning stance, which is why we called them lead learners. And so 10 years later, you'll see some of the same building blocks in that group. There's about anywhere from 15 to 25 educators from across the district coming together once a month to talk about SEL. And at base, what we are really asking them to do at every session is to pay exquisite attention to how adult and student SEL is living in their schools. But that just is a very simplistic understanding of what's happening at, in this group. Actually, very early on, what we realized is in order for SEL to truly be integrated and implemented, it can't feel like an additional thing. We're teaching math, we're teaching reading. Oh, we're also teaching SEL over here because we know that SEL is actually part of any learning process. And so this group asks the lead learner teachers to inquire about something academic in their classroom, but to use an SEL lens when thinking about adjusting and improving what's happening in that curriculum to better support all students, particularly the most marginalized students. And so when we ask teachers to talk about that, we ask them to also employ their own SEL competencies. So as a practitioner, you come with an incredible amount of expertise. And we know that teaching and learning is complex. And so when trying to apply instruction, when trying to support SEL in your school with those students who are in your classroom, what are the dilemmas that come up for you? So every time these lead learners meet, they talk about their pain points, their dilemmas, their challenges that are coming up along the way. And just even as educators in this space, think about the competencies you have to employ to talk about what you don't know with your colleagues. And then another practice that exists within that group is when you say that, what are the conditions that we are creating for one another so that we can have honest conversation? But because we know sometimes SEL can be interpreted as a culture of nice. We're going to be nice to each other. Or the lack of it can feel like a culture of fear. We're just afraid we're not going to really be honest. And so to avoid those pitfalls, while also supporting adults to use one another as tools to increase their own SEL competency, to increase their own academic instruction. We have another practice called supportive challenge, which is how do we, with care, with curiosity, really push each other's thinking so we can use the multiple perspectives in the room to further our learning as adults so that we can then further the learning of our students. And so these learners are engaging and talking about what they're uncertain about, engaging and supportively challenging one another on a monthly basis. And in the 10 years that we've worked with them, what we've realized is while those teachers have built their capacity and are beginning to facilitate the adult learning at their sites, if we ask them to do it alone, we're actually not supporting them in a way that really acknowledges their own SEL needs. And so over time, we've invited principals, school leaders to also engage in this work so they can build their own capacity to support adult SEL. And what they're asking themselves is, how do we lead with an SEL lens? Just like the teachers are asking themselves, how do we support academic instruction from an SEL lens? So you can see the symmetry that's happening across this system over time. This particular group, in the 10 years that we've had them, obviously there was a pandemic. There has been school violence. Just this past year, there were shootings and other violent acts on campuses. There have been multiple leadership changes, superintendents coming and going. There has been strikes. Having a consistent group where practitioners can come together to talk about their practice, to care for one another, has been a source of consistent adult SEL support in the system. You don't have to worry about where you're going to go to get support. That structure has been there through multiple pain points for the system, to be honest. And so when we think about that, it's actually more than just how do we implement SEL as adults. It's really how do we create spaces for our educators and our leaders to feel exactly what we're asking them to support in their students. And particularly during the pandemic, when we worked with principals, we realized, man, the adult SEL needs are really high. And so the more we can acknowledge and create intentional spaces where people can have adult SEL support in a way that also enables them to do their work in a more efficacious way, it's kind of just a win for everybody.
Covered so aspects of, like, as you were talking, I was putting mental notes down of, let me ask about leadership, let me ask about context, like let me ask about how you actually create space for hard conversations and to create this space of trust. And as I was writing these You continue to like tick off every box that I put on my notes. But this is a perfect segue to you, Mai Xi, because you've done some of this work with the adults in a community of practice and throughout the Sacramento area. Want to ask you, connecting back to some of what Jen has just mentioned, in Sacramento, you're thinking about supporting adult SEL at many layers across the system. Can you tell us about your efforts and why this is a priority for you and your team? And if you have connections to some of what Jen just mentioned, happy to hear you make those connections as well.
Absolutely. Bloodine, you said you're checking off all of the ways which Jen was talking about adult SEL across many layers, right? I was saying yes, because I think that to your point, Jen, the expectations that we would have for our young people are the exact same expectations that we would have for our adults, and certainly the same expectations that we would have across all of our systems, right? And leadership across all those systems. So, so in California, we're really thinking about ways in which we are cultivating social emotional learning to become the DNA for how we function, how we support each other, how we build partnerships and supports across different networks, from the state level down to the county, all the way through, creating a through line to districts and schools, and certainly to our communities. And so when I say partnership, back to that definition that Bloodine talked about at the beginning of our session, is this idea of how do we build those supportive communities in order to enact on the promise of social emotional learning, braided with equity, right? So how are we co-constructing? How are we co-designing? How are we constantly engaging in this feedback loop where we are calibrating our practices and the way of being and the way we are enacting on the implementation processes with each other? And so that it's not a vertical, hierarchical structure of supports, but really a horizontal system of approach to really thinking about the contribution that each system can add to, again, this through line of SEL for all adults and students and communities. So in California, we're really building this network of supports through what we call the CalHope student support community of practice, where we've engaged all 58 leaders, 58 County Office of Education leaders, to engage in a regular rhythm of community building, and also to be in partnership with each other, and to really build their capacity to lead for and to lead with their community partners. And then the thinking with these statewide communities of practice is that we are also modeling for our systems leaders ways in which that we would ask them to go into their regional hubs to also model similar communities of practice, again, with that value set of partnership and co-construction and co-designing with their districts and with their schools, and certainly with their community partners. And so that is the statewide DNA and process that we're really hoping to enact on across the state of California. And then specifically in the Sacramento region, and the work that we're trying to do, again, honoring that flow line, right, of state all the way down to classrooms and communities, we're really thinking hard about how to leverage adults in the system, systems leaders, so district folks, school site leaders, county leaders, to really build their transformative SEL leadership. And so really how to build networks of supports, networks of partnerships, and really helping our folks to create that critical awareness of how they show up, not just for each other, but for their systems. And, I keep going back to this word around partnership, because that is really the foundation for how we want them to be thinking about the work of social emotional learning, and certainly the work of how they, as the adults in the system, are partnering with their students in order to ensure that they're cultivating those conditions that are going to nurture the skills that we say are so essential for us to all embody what it means to be socially and emotionally well and to be thriving, especially in contexts where it's not primed, conditions aren't primed for everyone to thrive. And so the work that we're doing in Sacramento County is really to amp up the adult SEL systems that we know are so critical in order to enact on the promise of social emotional learning for our students.
Thank you for that, Mai Xi. I do want to ask follow-up questions, but I'm going to, before I ask some of those follow-up questions, Sue, I want to pull you into this conversation because you also bring a pretty unique lens coming from the rural community. And so I want to ask you the question of why is adult SEL a priority in your district and region? And what has that work looked like for you and your team, particularly in a rural setting?
Yeah, great. Thank you, Bloodine, and everybody else. And I too am making notes and connections here. And I want to the concept of becoming our DNA versus on our plate. All those metaphors about on the plate versus the plate or the thing. I like DNA a lot. So we are a rural setting. Just for context, I have 160 students, Western Lane County. Some of our students are on the bus an hour to get here, and to get home. High poverty rate, all the things that you think about. I just to share our water system literally ran dry for the third time this week. We have porta potties out front. The stuff we face is real. Why it's a priority in our district and region. I guess because there's a lot of hurt out there. And I think an important context that I share about our district, this is my first year here, and my learning has been 1/4 of our 7th through 12th graders have lost a caregiver, experienced the loss of a caregiver to death. That doesn't, not all the other things that happen to kids with caregivers, but have experienced the death of a caregiver. And our adults are being asked to hold that space and work with students who are experiencing deep grief and trauma, and hard lives. And our adults also have experienced deep grief and trauma and hard lives. And if we're not centering the humanness of our adults and our students before the learning of our adults and students, it's my belief we're just reinforcing the same systems that have oppressed and harmed many of our students. I think often in rural spaces, it's there's a deficit lens about the assets that we have here and that our students bring to school. And in fact, it's the exact opposite. Like, we have highly resilient students with creative and curious, all the things. Like, we have an amazing community here, and schools can be that space to bring folks together in truly authentic ways. Specifically, what we're doing in Mapleton that maybe is different from other spaces. Part of this comes out of, I have 9 teachers at the middle school, high school. So when we say community of practice, like, we're together all the time. We are a community of practice. And so how do you make SEL something different? Those types of things. So we have partnered with our Lane Educational Service District, who serves the whole county, where I also work. It's a weird arrangement, but their staff has come and provided the learning for our adults alongside our students. And this comes a lot from the space of, like, nothing about us without us. And if both of you spoke to creating that partnership between leadership and teachers, and in order to build with our educators and our students. And we're taking that approach of truly co-constructing the educational environment that we want here, starting with learning about regulate, relate, reason. It's a PD that adults across our entire county engage in together. And we extended that to do with students. Students love learning about their bodies. They love learning about interoception and coping strategies, and how to support their friends who are experiencing dysregulation, and how to support themselves. And actually what we're finding is that when that knowledge is shared, now it's not all on the teacher's shoulders. It's a community that's like, hey, how do we create an experience that is more healthy, well, and inviting, and that acknowledges the strengths in our community, that allows each person to share their identity and individualness in a way that connects across difference. And our students, the feedback has been like, kind of this like, yo, our teachers are real. It's fun to get to know them as humans. And I think at the core of everything we're doing, actually this learning series is ended up being titled Better Humaning. And I think at the core, that's what we're up to as educators. We're creating the humans of the future, and actually creating is a weird word, but we're working to facilitate and develop better humaning. And it turns out if we do that with co-do that with the adults, we're all learning to better human each day as well. So we might as well do that together.
Oh, so much there. I told you all this was an amazing panel. So much was just shared. I just want to invite us to kind of take a step back, because I'm sitting quite a bit from what Jen shared at the beginning, talking about the many layers of learning and creating brave and necessary spaces for adults to be able to have really hard conversations around what is it that we need to center and what is it that we need to grow around. To Mai Xi talking about SEL being the DNA of who we are and how we are, and now to Sue talking about humaning and better humaning, and how do we center our humanity in the midst of all of the challenges that are happening. So I know for me, I'm sitting and reflecting on quite a bit, but I want to invite all of you to just take a moment, and what's resonating the most for you? What is really striking a chord for you that you want to jot down somewhere, think about, even though you can't really unpack it fully right now, maybe you just jot it down. And then when you get a chance, you can go back to it and kind of start thinking about, what are some ways we can begin to start to work towards this thing that really resonated in this webinar today. So I'm just going to give you just a few seconds to just kind of jot that down on something that you have in front of you. And then we'll continue the conversation, but I didn't want to lose this moment. I know you're probably sitting with quite a bit as well. All right. So I hope you were able to capture something. I know it's not enough time to reflect. I wanted to give you at least a brief moment and recognize the fact that we are also human in this webinar and might need a brief moment to reflect. Jen, I want to go back to you and ask you just a question. I'm curious about what kind of evidence that your leaders are using, your learners. You said lead learners, so I'm calling them leaders and learners. What kind of evidence are they using to show progress towards their goals? And then what kinds of data is your organization using to show progress towards your goals with this program as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes the default belief about data is that it's a four-letter word. But I think that when we think about SEL and data, we have to also look at data with an SEL lens. What kinds of data supports us to see the whole child and what they are learning in real time? So when we think about the lead learners trying to understand the efficacy of their work, the type of data that they're gathering is beyond quantitative data. So very frequently people are looking at video data, drawings, writing, conversations with students. But probably something maybe the audience would be most interested in is that as a district, OUSD has integrated SEL competency into their grade reports, into their grading. And so students and families can see how teachers are assessing them on, their grades. However, that is just kind of an endpoint, right? And so our lead learners, for example, one this year, takes the questions and competencies in that grade report card and asks the students on a regular basis, how do you think you are doing in relation to these? And when we say asking, we're talking about like kindergartners, just asking like, how are you doing? Where do you think you are in terms of X or Y or Z? And then that teacher is using that student's self-report data, as well as the data that she is gathering from academic engagements and video recordings of those students talking in class, to not assess the student, but to really see the student, a snapshot of who that student is in that moment of time. The purpose of which is to support the educator to then adapt to better meet the student's needs. Because I think SEL, just like anything else, but maybe even more so, is an endless continuous process, right? If we were to look at data and say, oh, proficient, check, we don't have to worry about it anymore, we would be gravely mistaken. Just like you were saying, Mai Xi, it's a mindset and a habit that we're trying to cultivate within ourselves as educators so that it becomes ingrained in everything that we do, our response to students at all times, not just the thing that we're looking at today in this moment. And so when we talk about progress in the lead learner group, they're looking at it in real time to adjust and adapt and actually deepen the relationship that they have with students. Just as a final end note, you did ask about our organization. It is tricky because each of our adult learners is also in a different place. But two questions we often ask ourselves is just, is our space supporting them to have overall satisfaction in their work? Hopefully that's leading to more collective efficacy. And then just quite frankly, like, are you actually coming back to the teaching field as a result of this? And so last year, 100% of our participants did self-report that it did increase their overall satisfaction, and 85% of those lead learners did return to the classroom, which is a little over 10% higher than the retention rate of the district. So
Thank you for that, Jen. As you were speaking, one thing that continues to come up for me is, what are the preconditions that are required for adults to be able to sit in those spaces to gather this level of learning so that they can end up with data measures that you've just spoken to? And so for Mai Xi and Sue, coming from the county office, and Sue coming from the district and regional office, what are the preconditions that you are building, that you can speak to leaders about building, so that adults can lean into some of this learning in a way that they can actually become better human, that they can see that the leaders that are supporting them are actually embodying this idea of better humaning, as you said, Sue. So what are some of the ways in which you have kind of spoken to some of the preconditions that are needed for adults to be able to lean into these types of spaces to actually cultivate growth and some of those competencies that we talk about? So I see, we'll start with you.
Yeah, so I think the first one is to cultivate spaces, right? Cultivate the time, the structures, the spaces to enable for those reflective opportunities to surface. And I think the other piece is to enable our practitioners to set aside the need for, and Bloodine, we've been in conversations where you hear people asking for those tools. You hear people asking for those turnkey resources that they can turn around and do in their schools and or in their classrooms. And so I think it's reframing who can be the turnkey, right? That adults, in fact, are their own best resource. Adults can give themselves permission. Systems can give our adults in their systems the permission to critically reflect on who they are as human beings. Sue, I love what you said about better humaning, right? How do we create those spaces where our adults can better human and critically think about who they are, how they're showing up, the ways in which they are perpetuating, right, systems of inequity, the ways in which they are leaning into deconstructing systems that are not helpful, and enacting on and reimagining systems that can be helpful, right? Including the system of these individual adults who, by the way, do have some sense of agency, but do they have a space where they can reflect on what that agency can look like, individually as well as collectively? So I think for me, those preconditions would be about system structures that enable all of the ways in which our adults can connect to themselves and certainly can connect to others and create those partnerships and networks that can enable good work, good humaning, for lack of a better word, to take place.
Yeah, I think my answer is very similar. And going back to the part about asking for the list, like the how to, like, if you're looking for a list to be a better human, like, good luck. I think it's that deep internal work of like, who am I and what difference do I want to make in the world? And the more we can create the spaces and the time for that question within our curriculum, within our connections between leaders and educators, educators and students, educators and community, like I don't know, a couple things. So we do have a community of practice at the county level where we're bringing folks who are leading this work in our 16 school districts together to talk about these things. And two things resonate with me with this question. One, we talk a lot about Dr. Bettina Love's concept of freedom dreaming. And I think if we're not thinking about the world we want and who we want to be in the world we want, and instead we're talking about what comes first in a day and ABCD, like we get too into like describing the details versus describing the world that we want. I think it's actually two different things that we're up to. And when we talk about transformative, we need to be talking a lot about transforming towards what. It can't be away from something, it needs to be towards something different. And then I think these constructs of identity, agency, belonging, curiosity, and collaborative problem solving, I think the spaces that are being referred to, the time and structures and spaces, like how is that rooted in collaborative problem solving, and not problems rooted in deficit, but problems rooted in where are we now and where are we trying to get to inside of that. And then the last thing I'll say, my kind of first answer was, as a leader, like if you're a leader thinking about how you lead this in your space, I think trust is at the root of this. And so how do you authentically connect with the folks you're trying to lead in ways that build trust and give them permission to fail forward? When we try new things and we've never done them before, they're not supposed to work. And they're not supposed to be perfect. They're supposed to be a start and a seed that will grow. And so how do we give permission to not be perfect? And I think a whole lot of the education system and teachers, like that pressure that we put on ourselves as educators, is rooted in this culture of perfectionism, and that we have to get these outcomes and we're measured in these certain ways, and we're trying to, like, how do we lift that burden and say, try something cool and let's see what happens, and then go from there.
Love that, Sue. And I think one of the pieces that we have even grappled with within CASEL, as we've talked about different ways of approaching social emotional learning. We've talked about the five focal constructs. You've just mentioned them: the identity, agency, belonging, collaborative problem solving, and curiosity. And it just kind of has been sitting with us that it's hard to lean into any of those really well without first having this lens of curiosity and recognizing that you don't know everything about anything, and so those are some of the pieces that we continue to lean into. And I do want to ask a final question to all of you, and so if you can just kind of weigh in on this, because I'm sure folks are listening and thinking about, there are many initiatives that are happening in districts right now that they need to be focused on. There are significant student needs that they need to be focused on. There was significant instructional loss that they need to continue to try to fill. There are opportunity gaps that have not been closed. So there's a lot vying on the time that our educators have to be able to meet the need of what we say this educational system should meet. And yet we're here talking about adult social emotional learning. So I want all of you to kind of just offer your insight and your wisdom around, what have you seen as the barriers to supporting adult SEL at the school, at the district, at those level, at the classroom levels, and what could also be some contributors that can support this implementation, this embodiment that we've been talking about regarding adult SEL, particularly in a time like this. So I'm just going to open it up. Whoever feels led can jump in, and let's have a conversation around that question right there.
So I'll chime in because Bloodine, as you started listing those things, I was feeling a little bit of anxiety, right? And I think that as I talk to principals and teachers, those are their lived realities right now. Everything is coming all at once, and it's challenging, right? The question I would ask, and I continue to ask, is, and where are the opportunities given those challenges, right? So it's one thing to say we have learning loss. What about the learning gains, right? Yes, things are coming fast and quick. How do we also slow down and recalibrate? Because I think there's an opportunity to think about the both and. Again, acknowledging that these are really, really challenging times, right? We just came out, actually, I would say we're still in the pandemic and in this sort of crazy contextual world and lived experiences that are really, really painful. I mean, we have lost human beings. We have lost loved ones, right? Our children who were trying to make sense of the world around them had an additional layer of uncertainty. Their world shut down for 2 years. And so how do we approach this work, to Sue's point about transformation and transforming towards something? How do we leverage the opportunity to dream together, to reimagine a different world, a way of being? Yes, academics is certainly important. Yes, standards are important. But how do we ensure that we have people there to support all of those things that we say are so important to the future of our democracy, to the future of our society and our community? If we don't have human beings, right, the resources, the human resources to support those work, because people are saying, nah, I'm done. I can't do this. It's one more thing that I just don't have the bandwidth for. Then what is all of this for? And so I think it's an opportunity for us to reimagine back to this idea of humaning. Let's position human beings first, right? Let's recalibrate the ways in which we are building our connections to each other, reimagine ways that we can be a different kind of community that really thinks about the diversity and leveraging that as a rich strength, right? And in the ways that we can really be connected across our same sense of curiosity about each other, curiosity about what's to come that we can't even imagine because we don't know yet, but there's a beautiful something that could be happening. But we can't do all of those things if we are stuck on the deficits of what we don't have, the crises, right? The challenges, again, acknowledging those are real. And how do we think beyond the other ways that we can rethink and reframe so that we can move forward? Because I think we live very complex lives, and we also live these beautiful, amazing, transformative, and I think about the butterfly, right? And how we transform from this cocoon of uncertainty and into these beautiful butterflies. And so how we get there is going to be dependent on how we are having discourse about the challenges that are right now front and center, and trying to get through that and navigating through that in a way that will allow for all of us to move forward. And we can't move forward if we're always stuck on the I don't have, the crises, the deficits.
Wonderful.
Yes, I agree with that. And I also think, kind of practically speaking, change can feel really big, and that bigness of change can cause paralysis. And so, as leaders, I think one of our responsibilities is to make change feel doable and support others in change management. And to that end, I have a quote from Adrienne Marie Brown, who I read all of her stuff, and she has a quote from Emergent Strategy that just, what we practice at the small scale sets the patterns for the whole system. And so the system is comprised of individuals. We are those individuals. What we do every day, that's what the culture is and the practices are of our system. And so if we're talking about interruption, if we're talking about evolution, if we're talking about adaptation, we can do that at a small scale. Look at what you're doing every day, maybe something small. How is that supporting SEL for your students? Leaders, what are you doing every day? How is that supporting SEL for your adults in your building? District leaders, how are you doing the same? All of us have SEL needs. All of us do things or don't do things that are in service of SEL. And what we pay attention to, another quote from Adrienne Marie Brown, what we pay attention to grows. So if we just dedicate some time to focus on SEL in our day-to-day work, choose something small to say, maybe this is a place that I can leverage and create a change in. We do that regularly, big things can happen. And so I think one of the biggest things we can do to support change and inspire people to change is to just recognize that change starts and is actually propelled at the small scale.
I'm loving the shout out to Emergent Strategy here. Thank you. Just for rural folks listening in, we are small, and often I hear like, oh, we're so small, we don't have those resources. We're a 4-day week, we don't have the time. We're a, you name it. And the one word I have written for this question is the barrier is deficit thinking. And if we can challenge ourselves to look past the deficits and towards the opportunity and take one step forward at that small scale, things grow. And that's why I'm in this space here trying to lead, because actually small systems are a lot easier to move than the large ones. So you get to take steps and see what happens, and then say, oops, let's go another direction, or oh, there's potential, let's try this. For me, the biggest, but beyond deficit, I think sometimes we often default to what we know. And so I think in this work is, the barrier is what we've always done. And so how do we remove that and say, actually, let's try something different, even in small scale? I want to share something, and I don't know if it fits at this question or not, but it's in my mind, so I'm going to share it. But we held our first PD day with students and staff. I had no clue how it was going to go. I was just like, let's do it. So it went really well. And that literally the next day, 2 different classrooms rearranged their seating and were ready to start their day. And it like, to this idea of something small, that was a seed that planted. The way that discourse was happening in those spaces where our ESD staff came in and led, and the chance to be in community and alongside students and teachers, or with students and teachers together, produced this change seating structures immediately. We never once talked about changing seating structures, right? And that's a thing that started to grow, and then it changes pedagogy, and it changes the way we look at each other and believe in opportunity, all those things. So the contributors, the way we come alongside and recognize the humanness of each person in the building contributes to, and listen to their ideas, like authentically listen. Our students were like, oh, we have all these ideas about how space can be used in this building to make a safer space for us, or we hang out in the bathrooms because we need a break from everybody. If this space existed somewhere else, we would hang out there. And so now we're looking at having our students transform some of our spaces on campus. But I think coming alongside and truly authentically connecting and listening is the contributor to thinking of new ways to do things.
I think you all have summed it up in a way that I absolutely could not have. I so appreciate the time that you were able to spend with us. There's so much rich material that you all just dropped into the space today. I know that our audience will be grappling with what you've provided for quite some time. And so Jennifer On, Mai Xi Lee, Sue Wilson, just want to thank you for, first of all, the contribution that you make to this field on a consistent basis. I know that it's a thankless job that you all are doing, but it is so necessary. So just want to show you some love and just say thank you for what you do on a day-to-day basis to continue to center the needs of adults and the needs of students. So appreciate you and appreciate the time that you contributed and the expertise that you provided to this audience via this webinar. So thank you. And so what we would like to do, we have throughout this session gone through what we call at CASEL the 3 signature practices. We started with a welcoming. In the middle of the session of the webinar, we had just a moment to reflect, which is kind of our engaging practice. So we want to have an intentional close and invite you to participate in this process that can support a commitment to curiosity and learning. So you'll see 3 different prompts here, and we just invite you to select one that speaks to you right now. Based on what you've learned or what you've heard today in this webinar, what is something that you want to learn more about? You know, something that you've heard today that's really piquing your interest and piquing your curiosity. What is something that you want to learn more about? Or how can you connect and collaborate with someone on today's topic? Who would you want to connect with? How can you collaborate with that person? Write that person's name down somewhere so you don't forget. Or so if those 2 don't strike a chord for you, then how can you be more intentional about modeling SEL in the context that you're in and being the change that we would like to see? How can you embody SEL in a way in your context that really supports movement in this direction? So select one of those that speaks to you, and we invite you to push into the next step of learning as you reflect on one of those prompts. And with that, I want to thank you for just taking the time to be with us in this webinar.